and having somebody bring out a tarantula and putting it on my arm and, saying things like, I was trying to figure out a way to talk about fear, and hopefully it would crawl up my arm and onto my face. And then that would be removed, and then somebody would come in and would wrap a snake around my neck. And I was really working on this, except I thought about what happened to me when I was a boy and its negative effects on my grandmother. I was walking home from school, and I came across a snake, and I caught it, and I brought it home. And we had an old little fish bowl, and I created a snake-like environment, put some gravel and a few little trees and bushes and things in there, and put the snake in there, and then covered it with some stuff and poked holes. The whole thing. And sitting at the table with this bowl in front of me, and I am so stoked about having this snake, that I caught. And my grandmother comes walking around the corner, and she looks into the kitchen, and at that exact moment, that little snake goes like this. And stared right at her. My grandmother then screamed, ran to the bathroom, and started to throw up. And there was nothing quite like a little boy making his grandmother dry heave. So I'm at the table, just total shock. My mother staring at me, and in the background, I hear in the background. My mother was wiping her hands from washing dishes. She looked at me and she says, "You're going to have to let that go." So that story entered my mind, and I thought, that is the last kind of response I would want to get from you, running out the door or throwing up in your pews or anything. So I decided against that, so you need to be proud of the fact that I did. Some of you would kind of be freaked out by that. Yes. You're welcome. There's a difference between fears and phobias. A fear is an emotional response to a real or perceived threat. A phobia is a lot like a fear, but the distinction is the anxiousness that fear causes you. It causes you so much anxiousness that oftentimes you can't even function. It just paralyzes you. So I started to look around for some interesting phobias, and you can look these up. They're for real. Blutophobia is fear of getting clean. Alloxtosophobia is fear of opinions. Philophobia is a fear of close relationships. Somnophobia is a fear of falling asleep. Heliophobia is a fear of the sun. Chaetophobia is a fear of hair. Lachanophobia is a fear of vegetables. Hephaphobia is a fear of being touched. Coulrophobia is a fear of clowns. Xanthophobia is a fear of the color yellow. Neophobia is a fear of anything new. Hylophobia is a fear of forests. Turophobia is a fear of cheese. Decidophobia is a fear of deciding or making choices. Japherophobia is a fear of bridges. Descendophobia and ascendophobia is a fear of descending and ascending. Trypophobia is a fear of a small group of holes, bumps, or even circles. Ombraphobia is the fear of rain. Chronophobia is the fear of time passing. Papophobia is a fear of the Pope. And phobophobia is the fear of phobias. Now, these may be humorous to you because you don't experience them, but to some, these are very real. For the most part, however, the fears that you and I experience are not the ones shared by our ancestors, who were afraid of things like lion attacks and bear attacks. The majority of our fears are more mental. We start thinking about how others perceive us, or for that matter, our self-worth. And what makes our particular kinds of fears difficult is that there's no direct threat. It's this overarching feeling of, I wonder how we're perceived. So we're all afraid of something. There are a ton of different lists, but I think you'll find this interesting. You know what the top fear is of middle schoolers? How they're perceived by their peers. You want to know what the top fear of college freshmen is? The fear of change. The top fear of middle-aged people? Becoming disabled. And the top fear of senior citizens is the loss of independence. You know, it would do us well to know the top fears of the generations that surround us. What better way for us to strengthen our relationships as a church? Let me give you an example. You cross paths with a young person who's on the verge of graduating from high school, and they seem sullen and quiet. And you're wondering, what's the problem? I mean, this is the most exciting time of your life. It could be that that particular young person is scared to death about the change of leaving home and going to college. Or perhaps you come across an older person, and they seem quiet and kind of withdrawn. For all you know, that person might have just received the news that they're losing their driver's license, a huge loss of independence. I think the more that you and I know about the fears that affect the generations around us, the more we can effectively love each other. As we talk about fear, we're going to be talking about David. Now, this guy had a crazy life. It's quite a read. And he had to deal with fears that were at best bothersome, and at worst, they were life-threatening. Through the first part of David's life, I want to give you 12 lessons that we can learn about dealing with fear. Give you a little bit of background. David was the youngest of 8 sons, and his father's name was Jesse. And the name David means one who was well loved. But as we'll find, David's feeling of being loved is going to be significantly challenged. This story takes place in 1 Samuel. I'll start by talking about David's predecessor, Saul. Saul started well, but he made some significant mistakes that ultimately cost him his kingship. Because he disobeyed God's instructions, Saul had been rejected as the king of Israel. And the prophet Samuel, who was his spiritual advisor, told King Saul what God expected of him. Yet Saul took it upon himself to do it his own way. Saul thought that he was doing the right thing. He felt as though he duly sacrificed and believed that gave him license to alter God's plans. Though this isn't a study on Saul's life, it behooves us to read his story in 1 Samuel chapter 15, because it teaches us that though we may sometimes feel like Saul did, that our sacrifice grants us special dispensation to alter God's plan for us. Verse 15 tells us that obedience is better than sacrifice. So lesson number 1 is, regardless of our fear, we must obey what the Lord asks. The Lord viewed Saul acting outside his will as rebellion and arrogance. Now, Saul's rejection by God leaves the prophet Samuel in a tough spot, because though Samuel was justifiably upset with Saul, verse 35 said that Samuel mourned for him. Then in chapter 16, the Lord says, Samuel, stop mourning for Saul. Because God wanted to send Samuel to Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse, and it was there that Samuel was going to anoint the next king of Israel. What follows is a really interesting example of fear. This is Samuel's response to the Lord asking him to go to Bethlehem. 1 Samuel 16:1. Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears about this, he'll kill me." This proves that despite Samuel being a prophet, Samuel was also human, because he feared Saul more than he feared God. Samuel was well aware of God's power and that God was not to be disobeyed. He'd just seen the results of that in the life of Saul, yet he questioned God's plan. How many times have we worried about what people think more than what God thinks? How many times have we caved into the opinions of others because somehow we've forgotten the bad things that happened to us the last time we didn't follow God's direction? So lesson number 2 is, regardless of fear, we need to strive to please God more than people. God told Samuel to take a heifer with him and to invite Jesse and his sons to join him in sacrificing that heifer to God. And in case you didn't know, a heifer is a young cow that's not yet born a calf. God told Samuel that it was this sacrifice, at this sacrifice, that he would indicate which son was to be crowned king. So Samuel saw Jesse's eldest son, Eliab, and thought, well, this has got to be the guy. God's anointed stands before him. But the Lord corrected Samuel by saying, don't consider his appearance or his height, for I've rejected him. The Lord doesn't look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Oof. Isn't that the truth? How many times have we made snap judgments simply because of the way somebody else looks? So 7 of the sons of Jesse passed before Samuel, and God made it clear they were not his choice. Samuel then asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? And Jesse said, no, they're still the youngest. He's out tending the sheep. So they sent for him. David shows up, and he was God's choice. Samuel anointed him king. Now Saul, meanwhile, was tormented by an evil spirit. Thinking that they could soothe Saul, one of his attendants suggested he bring someone who could play the lyre. I don't know if you know, but a lyre is a U-shaped harp. In chapter 17, verses 17 and 18, it says, so Saul said to his attendants, find someone who plays well and bring him to me. One of the servants answered, I've seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the lyre. He's a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well, and he's a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him. It's interesting how these qualities are listed. He knows how to play the lyre, so he's a musician. He's a brave man and a warrior. So even though he was young, he was still a man's man. He speaks well, so he was articulate. He's a fine-looking man, so he looked like Pastor George. And the Lord was with him. He was a spiritual man. David came to Saul and entered his service and became an armor bearer. An armor bearer was a person who carried the large shield and perhaps other weapons for the king. And so David also continued to provide that soothing music for Saul when his spirit was troubled. In 1 Samuel 17, we start with one of the best-known stories in the Bible, the story of David and Goliath. It says, now the Philistines gathered their forces for war. So the Philistines occupied one hill, and the Israelites occupied another, and there was a valley in between them. And verse number 4 reads, a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. Let me tell you a little bit about Goliath. Goliath was from Gath, and Gath was home to the Anakites, a race of giants. In Joshua 11:22, it says, no Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. And this is not the first mention of the Anakites. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, we hear the story of the spies that Moses sent out to survey the land promised to the Israelites. What they saw shook them with fear. Verse 28 says, the people are stronger and taller than we are. The cities are large with walls up to the sky. We even saw Anakites there. Goliath was a champion. Now this word is a paraphrase of the Hebrew expression, a man in the place between. If a soldier remains standing in the space between two armies at the end of a battle, he is named a champion. And it appears that Goliath had been named a champion in previous conflicts. Now it's interesting, when you read this account, that Goliath walked out in front of the armies. And that's when he made his boast and made his challenges. But you find it interesting that as he walked out from that army, he was in the place between. And he was asking that an Israelite join him in the other direction. Goliath was 9 feet, they say between 9 feet 6 and 9 feet 9 inches tall. He wore a coat of armor that weighed 125 pounds. His shin guards were bronze. He had a bronze javelin on his back. His spear was about 2.5 inches in diameter, 26 feet long, and the head of that spear weighed at least 15 pounds. Imagine that. But to make it worse, he was a trash talker too. In verse 44, he tells David, come here and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. Goliath was challenging the Israelites to send one man to fight him, and the winner would take it all. The losing army would become the slaves of the winning nation, or the losing nation would become the slaves of the winning nation. So whoever fought Goliath was not just fighting for their own survival, fighting for the well-being of his nation. No pressure, right? Every day for 40 days, Goliath came out and challenged the Israelite army. And what was the Israelite army's response? The soldiers were paralyzed with fear. Here's another example of fear. Looking in the eyes of a giant, something that seems insurmountable, beyond our abilities and strength. Those are the occasions there are occasions in years of my life that we experience those very real fears, those giants. So David had been going back and forth, serving Saul and tending his father's sheep. And then one day, David's dad says, hey, I want you to grab this grain and bread, and I want to take it to your 3 oldest brothers. Those 3 oldest brothers were in Saul's army. So when he arrives, he leaves his things with the keepers of supplies, and he went to check on his brothers. And it was at that moment, Goliath came out and once again challenged the Israelites. The Israelite soldiers were saying that to the soldier that beat Goliath, the king would give great wealth, his daughter in marriage, and the family would no longer have to pay taxes. Now, this is just my opinion, but that's a pretty dangerous way to get a tax exemption. It's just me, but I don't know whether I'd do it. So upon hearing Goliath's insults, David said, who does this guy think he is, defying the armies of the living God? Enter David's oldest brother, Eliab, who basically said to David, and who do you think you are? You're just a shepherd boy who's conceited and wicked. Lesson number 3, sometimes our desire to conquer fear will be challenged by those closest to us. There will be those moments that you make a decision. You're going to challenge this fear, and when you inform the people closest to you of that decision, they could very well challenge your choice and perhaps even inform you that you are underqualified to do what you say you're going to do. David answered like any little brother, now what have I done? Can't I even speak? So he turns and starts the conversation with somebody else, and that conversation was overheard and communicated with King Saul, who then sent for David. David then told Saul, and this is my paraphrase, don't be scared. I'll go out and fight this guy. Saul replied, you can't. You can't. You're just a boy. And Goliath has been a warrior since his youth. Lesson number 4, sometimes to battle fear, you're going to have to overcome people's preconceived ideas of both the situation and of you. You decide that you're going to face a fear head on. People catch wind of it, and they say something like this to you. Hey, I can appreciate your bravery, but you're crazy if you think you can do this. David then gave Saul a verbal resume of his accomplishments. Look, as a shepherd, I chased down both a lion and a bear who had taken some of my sheep. I caught them, and I killed them. Impressive. So then Saul tries to dress David in his tunic and armor, but David wasn't used to them. Lesson number 5, sometimes well-intentioned people will try to help you get through your fear by asking you to face it the way they would do it. In Proverbs 11:14, it says, for lack of guidance, a nation fails, but victory is won through many advisors. Sure, David listened to Saul. David tried on Saul's armor, but ultimately David knew he had to face this fearsome task in the way that was true to the way God made him. We need to know ourselves, folks. And there will be times that we need to seek counsel, sure. But sometimes we'll have to ultimately face our fear in a way, the particular way that God made us to face it, regardless of what others may think around us. So we talked about Goliath. Let's compare him to David. What did David have? Well, he had a sling. I got to tell you, don't be fooled. Don't be fooled by that. Because I was reading that a rock let go from a sling like David's had roughly the same stopping power as a .45 caliber handgun. Did you know that? It's pretty amazing. And In fact, good ancient slingers were known to hurl stones 440 yards, the length of 4 football fields. And as for accuracy, one ancient writer said that the best slingers would wound not merely the heads of their enemies, but any part of the face at which they might have aimed. So lesson number 6, sometimes you'll face a fear with a weapon that everybody who's uninformed around you will think is inadequate, but you know that it will work. And David also had his staff. It's interesting because Goliath sees it, and he says, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" Now, interestingly enough, there is no other mention of that staff in this story. And I've read that David was using it as a distraction. Apparently it worked because Goliath didn't see David's sling that was aimed at his head. Here's the other thing that David had. He had confidence in his past experiences. In 1 Samuel 17:36, it says, "Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. And this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he's defied the armies of the living God." Lesson number 7, when we're fearful, we need to remember how God helped us achieve past victories. Psalm 77:11 says, "I'll remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I'll remember your miracles of long ago." Folks, there will be moments that your strength will come from reminding yourself about God's provision in your past life. So, David hits Goliath with a stone, kills him, and chops off his head. From then on, Saul kept David pretty close. And David was so successful in subsequent battles that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. But when David started receiving bigger accolades than Saul, Saul became jealous and fearful that the only thing left for David was to take the kingdom away from him. Lesson number 8, unhealthy fear will sometimes lead to unhealthy thoughts. In other words, we'll become paranoid and connect dots that really don't connect. So Saul once again dealt with an evil spirit, and David was there playing the lyre. But this time the Bible says that the spirit came upon Saul forcefully. And Saul hurled a spear at David, hoping to kill him. This happened twice. And fortunately, both times David was able to avoid getting hit. David continued to be successful in battle. He was highly esteemed by both the people and the army. And then Saul's anger gave way to fear and the hope that the Philistines would get David out of his life by killing him. It came to a point that Saul gave his daughter to David in marriage. In verse 21, Saul said, "I'll give her to him so that she may be a snare to him and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." A marriage made in heaven. Interestingly enough, in Psalm 18:28 and 29, it says, "When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days." But David, he continued to be victorious over the Philistines. So Saul then asked his attendants and his son Jonathan to kill David. Well, Jonathan and David had become pretty close friends. And Jonathan came to David's defense. And it seemed to smooth things over for a while. But once again, Saul tried to kill David with a spear. This time, David escaped by having his wife lower him through a window and down a wall. And now David's on the run. His buddy Jonathan was optimistic, but David knew that given the chance, Saul was going to kill him. So David and Jonathan hatched a plan. There was going to be a new moon feast. And David wasn't going to attend. And Jonathan told him, "If my father becomes angry at your absence, it would prove that your life is in danger." Well, Saul got so angry that he hurled a spear at his own son. So Jonathan told David, "Yeah, you're in danger." So David's on the run. He came to the land of Nob and a priest named Ahimelech. David was given some bread, and when he asked for a weapon, Ahimelech gave him the very sword that David used to kill Goliath. From there, David went to Gath, and he experienced another fear. The king's servant, one of the king's servants there, recognized who he was. So think of this. The same shepherd boy who killed a lion, who killed a bear, who killed the mighty Goliath, and who killed hundreds of Philistines, faced this particular fear by pretending to be insane. The king then had him removed. Lesson number 9, unhealthy fear will sometimes cause us to act in ways that surprise even us. From Gath, David came to the cave of Adullam, where men who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and those 400 soldiers became David's army. Saul was hot on his trail and went to see Ahimelech, the priest that gave David the bread and the sword. And because Ahimelech helped David, Saul had him and 84 other priests killed, along with everybody from the town of Nob, men, women, children, cattle, donkeys, and sheep. Lesson number 10, sometimes unhealthy fear will drive us toward actions that are cruel to other people. David then heard that the Philistines were attacking Keilah. David's men were afraid, but David inquired of the Lord and followed God's leading. Lesson number 11, when you're afraid, the best thing you can do is to ask the Lord about it and then follow his leading. David beat the Philistines and continued to go from place to place with Saul in hot pursuit. David then left Keilah and moved about the wilderness. Saul got a beat on him and started closing in when he got the news that the Philistines were raiding the land. Saul then stopped his pursuit of David and went to fight the Philistines. And after fighting the Philistines, Saul heard that David was in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 300 men and went after him. While there, Saul went into a cave to relieve himself, not knowing that David and his men were far back in that very same cave. David's men told him, hey, God's giving you Saul. He's giving him to you to deal with as you wish. So David crept up to Saul, and with the opportunity to kill him, David instead cut off a corner of his robe. And interestingly enough, after doing that, David's response was pretty surprising. In chapter 24, it reads, then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, my Lord, my king. When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, Saul, why do you listen when men say David is bent on harming you? This day you've seen me with your own eyes, how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay hand on my Lord because he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but I didn't kill you. See that there's nothing in my hand to indicate that I am guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I've not wronged you, but you're hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you've done to me, but my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds, so my hand will not touch you. Against whom has the king of Israel come out? Who are you pursuing? A dead dog? A flea? May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand. When David finished saying this, Saul asked, is that your voice, David, my son? And he wept aloud. You are more righteous than I, he said. You've treated me well, and I've treated you badly. You've just now told me about the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you didn't kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him go unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know that you'll surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. Now swear to me by the Lord that you will not kill off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family. So David gave his oath to Saul. Saul returned home, and David and his men went up to the stronghold. Lesson number 12. Though we may feel justified, we must never let our fear drive our decisions or actions. Because regardless of everything that Saul had done against him, David would not harm Saul because he considered him to be God's anointed. So as I conclude, Every single one of us experiences fear. My question is, what has your fear done to you? Has it caused you to disobey God? Has it caused you to please people more than your Creator? Has your desire to overcome fear been challenged by those closest to you? In dealing with your fear, are you having to overcome people's preconceived ideas about you? Do you feel pressured to face your fear in a way that may work for someone else, but not for you? Has someone told you that the weapon you want to use to conquer your fear is inadequate? Has your fear caused you to forget the victories of your past? Have you started to act in unhealthy ways? Are you looking into the eyes of a giant, something that seems insurmountable and beyond your strength? And when was the last time you asked the Lord to help you with your fear, and then listened to him and followed his leading? At the conclusion of our time together, some folks are going to come up here, and they're prepared to pray with you. And beyond that, here at Bethel, we offer ministries that will give you a safe place to share your fears, to help you get a godly perspective, and to gain some emotional support. Together, let's bring our fears to the Master and let him do his work.